Neighborhood first. I know it sounds like your society's president's favorite slogan, but it's also a geopolitical reality. Strong and friendly neighbors are a boon. Scheming and unstable ones, well, not so much. The current Indian government has made this a cornerstone of its foreign policy. Neighborhood first. All neighbors have benefited from this, but one country stands out, and that's the Maldives. India's Defence Minister Rajnath Singh is in the Maldives on a 3-day visit. He has some big meetings lined up. Maldivian President Ibrahim Soli will meet him. So will the defense and foreign ministers of the country. Rajnath Singh will also hand over some military hardware to the Maldives. One is a fast patrol vessel ship. The other is a landing craft. Both these will be used by the Maldivian National Defense Forces. So that's the official agenda. What about the political objectives? This trip is important for two broad reasons. Number one, reaffirming India's commitment to the Maldives. It sounds generic, right? But not if you consider what China is up to. In the last decade, China has expanded its footprint in the Maldives. It is upgrading airports, building houses, bridges, even harbors. But the downside is this: a lot of loans. Reports say the Maldives owes China around $1.4 billion. Their total GDP is just $5.4 billion, and they have loans worth $1.4 billion. So India has been trying to reverse this process to once again become the #1 partner of the Maldives. We'll talk about that later. But for the moment, let me tell you about the second reason. The Maldives will be holding elections in September. It promises to be a consequential one for India. Why? Because support for New Delhi is not bipartisan in Mali. It depends on which party is in power. The current president, Ibrahim Soli, is closer to India. He says his policy is India first. And the opposition? Well, exactly the opposite. The Maldivian opposition has been running an anti-India campaign. It's called India Out. Its poster boy is this man, former President Abdullah Yameen. He ruled the Maldives from 2013 to 2018, and during this period, he pushed the country closer to China. He joined the Belt and Road Initiative. He signed a free trade agreement, and he also saddled his country with Chinese debt. So what does he want now? He wants a return to closer ties with China. Yameen is expected to challenge Soli in the month of September. But as things stand, he cannot contest. He was convicted of corruption and money laundering last year. Unless he can clear his name, he won't be on the ballot. Nonetheless, the opposition agenda is clear. Push out Indian influence from the Maldives. The question is why? India has consistently contributed to the Maldivian growth story. $500 million in grants, not loans, grants, $500 million, $800 million in a line of credit. Not to mention the vast defense cooperation. Around 70% of the Maldivian defense training is done by India. A lot of equipment also comes from India. And ironically, that is exactly what the opposition has a problem with. They've accused India of violating Maldivian sovereignty. They say India has stationed troops in the country, which is all bluster, by the way. But as we have seen with hyper-nationalists, bluster can be effective. The fact is, maritime security is non-negotiable for the Maldives. They need well-trained sailors. They need modern landing craft. They also need Indian intelligence. There is nothing nefarious about any of this. It's common bilateral practice. India, Sri Lanka and the Maldives regularly conduct drills in the Indian Ocean. The idea is to be prepared for any challenge, like natural disasters or shipping accidents, even pirates. So in recent years, defense has become a cornerstone of this relationship. Since 2016, India and the Maldives have been holding defense cooperation dialogues. The last one was held just 2 months back in March 2023. So from India's perspective, the plan is quite clear. Keep supporting development and defense projects. Don't give China an opportunity to sweep in. But that also depends on the domestic politics in the Maldives. New Delhi must work harder to win hearts and minds, to make sure that the anti-India sentiment is contained. And how do you do that? Well, soft power always works. India sends the most number of tourists to the Maldives, even more than China and the US, and that's one place to start, tourism. So are historical links and cultural links. The Maldivian language traces its roots to Sanskrit and Pali. There is also interest in Indian movies and songs. The idea should be to capitalize on all of this, to convert this relationship into a bipartisan one. If not, It will be a missed opportunity for both sides. Do you remember the Indo-Pacific? I won't blame you if you don't. It was all the rage before last year, but then Russia invaded Ukraine and suddenly all the attention is back on Europe. But that does not mean the Indo-Pacific is doing any better. The Chinese threat is still there. Maritime incursions, unnecessary military drills, it's all happening in the shadow of Ukraine. But that's the thing about geopolitics. You cannot afford to be distracted or myopic. You must be ready to multitask. The question is Joe Biden up to that challenge? Well, his schedule certainly says he is. The US president hosted the South Korean president last week. This week, he's hosting the president of the Philippines. And later this month, he's hitting the road. Papua New Guinea first and Australia after that. All these trips and summits are focused on one region, the Indo-Pacific. Let's begin with the ongoing one. The president of the Philippines landed in Washington on Sunday. This man, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., a.k.a. Bong Bong Marcos, that's what he's called. He'll be meeting Joe Biden later today. It promises to be a tough balancing act for him. On the one hand, Marcos wants to deepen his ties with the US, forge an even stronger relationship, he says. Those were his words. At the same time, he's keen to be on China's good books. He has promised a quote-unquote golden age in relations with China. So it'll be a balancing act. And for Joe Biden, this meeting is already a concession. Let me tell you why. Senator Biden was a critic of Marcos Sr. This was back in the 70s and 80s. Marcos was a dictator. He ruled the Philippines for 20 years. Now his son is in power and President Biden is courting him. The same son who has lawsuits pending against him in US courts. He is being welcomed by the US president. So much for putting principles first. Looks like Biden has suddenly discovered political pragmatism. Either way, today's talks will heavily feature defense. The US has access to 9 military bases in the Philippines. The assumption is they will be key in the defense of Taiwan. Now, Marcos has tried to play it safe so far. He granted America access to more bases. At the same time, he stopped them from storing lethal weapons. Sort of like a half measure. Biden will be hoping to bring the Philippines firmly into his corner. His job is to reaffirm US commitment on 2 things. One is mutual defense. The second is financial assistance and development. So that's Joe Biden's agenda this week, getting the Philippines on board. Later this month, he'll be traveling to Papua New Guinea, the first American president to travel there in more than a century. And that should tell you something about the neglect. In Papua New Guinea, Biden will attend the Pacific Islands Forum. 18 leaders of the Pacific Islands will be present. So will the leaders of Australia and New Zealand. Interestingly, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi will also be in the country. He too will meet the Pacific leaders. And that should tell you how much attention this region is now getting. In fact, Joe Biden's Pacific pivot started last year. He hosted Pacific leaders at the White House. He also pledged aid and dispatched Vice President Kamala Harris on a tour. Now he himself is on the job. The question is, will it be enough? Because the US has long ignored these islands in the Pacific. It had unmatched military power in the region, so nothing else mattered. Not financial aid, not infrastructure projects, not climate change investments. But China was playing the long game here. China is now the biggest bilateral lender in the region, much bigger than America and Australia. It has funded more than 100 projects. I'm talking about roads, airstrips, ports, strategic assets with civilian and military uses. China has an investment in all of them. And last year, it pushed for even greater influence. China pitched a security pact with 10 Pacific nations. It was a sweeping proposal. Reports say it would have given China military bases in the region, even allowed them to deploy troops. Thankfully, the Pacific nations rejected it. And that rejection should give Biden some hope. But if he wants to recruit Pacific Islands against Beijing, he must do 2 things. A, put his money where his mouth is. The Pacific Islands need help to fight against climate change. It's an existential threat for them. They need millions of dollars in investment to tackle it. And secondly, Biden needs to build a broad coalition. The US alone cannot convince the islands, but a broader alliance of democracies can. Which is why Prime Minister Modi's presence could be a game changer here. The Pacific Islands have already been let down by the US, Australia and New Zealand, but India is different. India is a member of the Global South, and it's now on the high table. India's lessons and skills could be key for the Pacific region. In return, New Delhi will also get some valuable diplomatic support, because don't forget, every vote counts at the UN. And the Pacific Forum alone has 18 votes. All these meetings and trips will conclude at the Opera House in Sydney. That's where the Quad leaders are meeting. It's not going to be an easy mission for Joe Biden. You can't neglect countries for decades and expect them to support you later. Biden's test will be convincing Pacific leaders about his campaign slogan in 2020, that America is back. And now it's time for Vantage shots, images that tell the story. Starting with the US, a powerful tornado in Florida overturned cars and destroyed houses. Authorities are cleaning the debris and assessing the damage. In China, a wingsuiter successfully flew through the Tianmen cave, becoming the first Chinese man to ever do so. In Venezuela, Russian gymnasts participated at the Alba Games under their flag. And finally, what makes May the 1st significant, apart from the fact that it's May Day? We're taking you back in history. On this day, Fidel Castro banned elections and declared Cuba a socialist country. The year was 1961. Castro was addressing hundreds of thousands of Cubans at a May Day parade. He identified himself as a Marxist and Leninist. This happened right after the US government made an attempt to overthrow Castro's government, but was unsuccessful. He was unapologetically anti-American. It established close ties with the Soviet Union. During his rule, Castro created a one-party government. He wanted to control all aspects of Cuba's politics and economy. We're leaving you with this. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
Holy cow.
Oh my God, it's like right in front of it. Oh my
Email exchanges from inside the BBC, they talk about the risk of violating Indian laws. It's easier to rake up the freedom of speech debate, but does it give anyone a free pass to knowingly violate the law? America supports India because it needs India's support in return. And India is working with the US because it suits India's interests. This is how geopolitics works. Last night, he diffused a crisis with his defence minister. But today, Netanyahu was confronted with a new problem. His cabinet seems to have rebelled against him. The UK is looking at the Indian subcontinent to fill its coffers. That India seems to be negotiating from a position of power, like a partner and not a former colony. The US and Russia are dangerously close to an armed conflict. This year, 2023, New Delhi will be the capital of global diplomacy. For a country as diverse as ours, with 88% of the population illiterate, it was a very big deal to write a constitution, and that too, the world's largest. Meanwhile, if we may, here's a Republic Day gift from India for the BBC. A list of suggestions for the BBC for their upcoming documentaries. Number 1, the Kohinoor and the colonial loot. Number 2, an outdated monarchy and unhealthy obsession with the royals. Number 3, racism in 2023. We're waiting.